would love to hear what Des has to say, but are not able to be with us today. So it gives me great pleasure and great relief to introduce to you today Professor Des Thompson. Des is a highly influential ecologist who's made a great and lifelong contribution to nature conservation and upland ecology at both the national Scottish level and international levels too. But perhaps even more importantly for us, he comes from within our catchment area from the Highland village of Culrain. Des is now with Scottish Natural Heritage and he's the principal advisor on biodiversity and chairs a number of national and international groups. He's published widely and collaboratively on topics covering such things as birds of prey, shorebirds, mountain and moorland ecology, and the state of nature in Scotland and Firth of Scotland too. He's the chairman of the Field Studies Council, the UK's leading provider of outdoor environmental education, and a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And yeah, so I'd like to hand over the floor to Des and say, welcome Des, and thank you for sticking with us when we had our technical problem.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very kind and generous introduction. And I suppose as someone who's missed several ferries heading for the Isles, it's probably not surprising that I should have these difficulties, but special thanks to Rory for helping us out. Look, I want to spend just a wee while talking about COPs, the process we've been through and where we go next. I'll just see if I can get my next slide. So I'll talk about the COPs process, the conference of parties, the crisis we face at the moment, and then what we can do to try and get beyond the state we're in at the moment. And these two slides are of Neppy State and down in the south of England, showing a before and after for 20 years, and quite a remarkable transition in rewilding on the right-hand side. So it's the COP26, the climate COP that's very much in our minds at the moment, but we've also got a COP process, COP15 process running, dealing with draft global biodiversity framework. And I've simply shown a simple graphic here of where we go with both of these COPs. The 4 months to go to the final COP15, when we will be producing a new global framework for tackling the biodiversity crisis. And the COP26, which has got 2, possibly 3 days to go, which of course is dealing with the climate emergency that we face. Just a reminder, what is a COP? It's a conference of parties. It's been held every year since 1995. It's convened under the United Nations. It's got the aim of finalizing, really fighting global warming and responding to the impact of climate change. And what's so special about COP26 is the UK is hosting it in partnership with Italy. And on the right-hand side here, I've shown the trajectory we've been on from 2010 through 2020, when of course we had problems, the COVID pandemic pushing back a whole range of events, right through to 2050 to 2045 in Scotland, when we hope to reach net zero. And you'll see there's a whole range of activities that we're involved in on this trajectory. Next year, 2022, we will be publishing a new fresh Scottish biodiversity strategy for Scotland. For 2030, we'll have a global stocktake on the state of nature, and we'll also be reviewing the Scottish climate change plan. So let's go into the COP in a bit more detail. And for COP15, the biodiversity COP, there are 3 things to note. There's been an Edinburgh process running, which has resulted in the Edinburgh Declaration, and this is really a declaration that involves the subnational governments, the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, and regions from across the world, right down to local authorities and a whole range of interest organisations. And if you get a chance, just click on the Edinburgh Declaration for Biodiversity and you'll see the range of promises there in the work we can do to help biodiversity locally and indeed nationally. And then we've got the Convention of Biological Diversity holding official meetings, scientific, technical matters, called implementation and open-ended working groups. And Scotland contributes to the UK position then. And then a whole series of events are planned towards final COPs involving partners, including my own organisation, Nature Scot. Now let's just turn to COP26, the climate COP. So here I've just set out the timetable that we've been working to so far. So 1st and 2nd November, we had the World Leaders Summit. And then thereafter, each day is devoted to one theme. So on the 3rd of November, finance, 4th, energy, 6th of November was nature, yesterday was transport, today is cities, regions and the built environment. And then by the 12th, we should have the closure of negotiations, though it would not be unusual or so unusual for the negotiations to run into the Saturday on the 13th. So the COP26 is being held in Glasgow, and you may have heard reference to 3 zones. The blue zone, which is United Nations controlled, where the 196 contracting parties meet, ministers, officials, delegates, observers, and the medias all congregate. And when you see the reports coming in from the TV screens, or your reports on the radio, they're all coming from what's called the blue zone. We then have the green zone, which is UK government controlled, where a whole range of activities are taking place. And then, of course, in Glasgow, beyond great panoply of arts, culture, community and Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council events. And just by way of example, so for my own organisation, we've had quite a significant presence in the blue zone, in different parts, what's called the blue zone, with a heavy focus on peatland restoration, working collaboratively with the Nordic countries in particular, sessions on nature-based solutions, Scottish bonsai landscape being showcased in the atrium, and the Edinburgh Declaration, and a number of other activities in what's called the Multi-Action Pavilion. So within this blue zone, there's a whole range of activities taking place, led by a great range of organisations. Then in the green zone, the UK controlled zone, there are also many activities taking place, and of course in Glasgow and beyond. So the COP is not just about ministers and officials coming together, it's also trying to involve a great many government agencies, NGOs, community groups, etc. And the headline messages for COP26, so far as we concerned with the nature crisis is concerned, is nature is climate, climate is nature. 3 key messages. We have a twin climate and nature crisis, because climate and nature are coupled, and you can only tackle both by tackling them together. Nature itself can contribute to more than 30% of our net zero targets, which we hope to meet by 2045. And the involvement of people from across all society is developing and delivering nature-based solutions, which will lead to a just transition. Now, having given you what we hope will happen in COP26, here's my take on what's happened so far, day by day. First Monday, well, the United States joined in. That in itself was very significant after what happened with the Trump presidency. On the Tuesday, we had the promise of the end of deforestation by 2030, with £14 billion being pledged. Wednesday, we had promise of methane levels being reduced to 30% of the 2020 levels by 2030, and 90 nations pledging to that. On the Thursday, coal-fired power will be phased out by 2040, with 40 nations signing up to that. Friday was Youth Day. Saturday for us, the Nature Scot was very significant. The Scottish Government announced a Nature Restoration Fund of £55 million to be spent over the coming 3 years. And of course, we had around 100,000 people protesting in Glasgow. Moving into this week, on Monday, we had the legitimacy of COP26 being called into question by many organisations, essentially getting concerned as we were moving towards the final week. Tuesday, the Climate Action Tracker was published, and this announced that temperature rises were likely to be as high as 2.4 degrees centigrade by the end of 2100, and that really would be disastrous globally. And for Wednesday, we had discussions about transport. Boris Johnson returned to Glasgow, and then we had this extraordinary latecomer, the US-China statement on tackling emissions. And that really is significant and will play out today and tomorrow. And something like a US-China statement is so significant because something like 30 virtual meetings have taken place over the last 10 months in order to get to this stage. But for me, one of the most graphic images I've seen over COP26 is this image I've put here, the Minister for Tuvalu in the South Pacific addressing COP26 from a country which is suffering very significantly from sea level rise due to climate change. And that takes me into the COP26 site map, and I've talked about the blue and green zones, and this graphic provided by my colleague Clive Mitchell really brings alive what's taking place. You look at the top left-hand corner of my screen, the plenary and presidency rooms within the blue zone. That's where the high-level statements and ambition is being thrashed out. And the bottom in these green rooms, we've got alliances agreeing priorities and the tactics and procedures that are needed to thrash out the text of the final agreements. And then moving to the right, you've got the pavilions where countries and organizations are sort of busy working away, giving presentations. And then you have the action hub, the right-hand side, where more civic society and events are taking place. But the issue with all this is it's all contained within this blue zone bubble. And many people out with the bubble are not feeling that they're terribly closely involved. And that's a real challenge in terms of trying to develop the agreement from COP26. So let's stand back from this and just reflect on the nature of the threat and thinking about climate change and the risk of flooding. In Scotland, if you look at the risks of flooding, they are absolutely considerable. As many as possibly 290,000 homes, businesses and services at risk of flooding, 2,000 kilometres of a road network, 500 kilometres of a rail network, and at least 20,000 hectares of agricultural land, all at risk from climate change, from flooding directly. And of course, we're having to live with flooding. This graphic provided by Professor Alan Werity, who has long-standing expertise in tackling flooding, and we have sustainable flood risk management plans underpinned by legislation. And all the time we're having to balance the social needs against the economic costs and working with nature where possible. So Scottish Government, local authorities and householders all have a role to play in learning to live with floods, and floods are inevitably because of climate change. Now we then come to the nature crisis, and as I've said, for both the COP26 and COP15, we have to combine action to tackle both crises. Essentially, we need to repair decades, if not centuries, of mismanagement of the land and sea. And this has led to the current climate nature emergency. With about 30 to 40% of Scotland's greenhouse gas inventories due to climate nature issues. And it's worth reminding ourselves that we are in the decade of the United Nations decade of ecosystem restoration. So ecosystem restoration is very much at the forefront of work we put in place to tackle the climate nature emergency. Now on the right-hand side, we've got a number of scenarios for biodiversity. And you look at the bottom line, the grey line, that shows the trajectory for the richness of biodiversity taking us through to 2100. If we have business as usual, we will not see an upturn in biodiversity, we'll see this ongoing decline. With the middle line, the orange line, we might be able to halt biodiversity loss if we make sure that a whole range of conservation actions are put in place and there's an increase in funding. We might just be able to halt the loss of biodiversity. But really, we'll only bend the biodiversity curve, the green graphic that's shown here, if we fundamentally transform how we look after nature. And here we think holistically. about consumption, about demand, and about reaching into far greater numbers of people and organisations and enterprises beyond the traditional ones we've worked with so far to try and conserve nature. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Sorry, just playing up a bit there. So the problem first, the nature crisis. We've got the Living Planet Index showing just how globally different facets of biodiversity are suffering across the globe, whether it's in Latin America, in the Caribbean, or in Africa. And the bottom graphic, of course, showing now this well-kent graphic of temperature increase and increasing exponentially. We have a nature crisis in Scotland, and it was only in December of last year that Scottish Government declared that we have a nature crisis. It's worth reflecting why. Well, I think there are 4 reasons that I've listed here. The disconnect between people and nature, exacerbated by the social, economic, and environmental inequalities being a root cause. Centuries of deforestation, intensification of land and sea use, and fragmentation against a backdrop of an oceanic climate, a sort of harsh, cool, wet, windy climate that can be stifling for many important areas of biodiversity. And the need then to halt the losses of species, important habitats and landscape quality, and then to restore and regenerate nature. That is going to take time. And in order to achieve this and to address the disconnect, we need fundamental increase in the investment in nature at the expense of extractive production, such as related to food and timber production and fuel. And in Scotland, we've got this new biodiversity indicator, and the sort of headlines are indicating that we've had a 24% decline in abundance of recorded species in 1994, a 14%, almost 15% contraction in species range since 1970. And indeed, the assemblages of species are becoming increasingly uniform, with the generalists tending to dominate over specialists, offering less diversity overall. So fundamentally, we have a nature climate crisis, a triple challenge. We've got to transition to a net zero economy. We have to enhance the state of nature and first halt the loss of biodiversity. And we have to adapt to climate change. And we have to do all 3 of these things at the same time, in the same areas, land and sea. And nature-based solutions alone can deliver around a third of our net zero targets. I'll say a bit more about it shortly. So one way of looking at this is to think about what we could have or should have in 2045, the net zero year, and the interim of 2030, because unless we're clear for nature, unless we are clear about what it is we're seeking, what success would look like, it's very difficult to plot your journey to take you up there. So I've shown 2 graphics here from Scotland, the big picture, and Northwoods rewilding. And clearly, in taking this work forward, we need to be evidence-based. We need to meet the climate and nature recovery goals together. Whatever we do needs to be shared and inspired, and ideally the journey we're going to take in order to have this far greater success for nature needs to be co-designed, and of course we have to have sufficient resources in place. And Nature Scot, working with Scottish Government, is sort of beginning this journey now in developing a new biodiversity strategy, and we will be working with a whole range of stakeholders and community groups across Scotland to achieve this. And it's fascinating when you sort of delve into the imagery that's available on the state of nature. They really do give you a sort of sense of what nature could be like when it's restored and regenerated, such as that image in the top right-hand corner with a meandering river with woods lining the edge to help combat climate heating and to also improve the richness of biodiversity in the watercourses, and of course to manage flood risk lower down. But in taking this work forward and tackling the nature crisis, we've got some very difficult choices, and I'd be fascinated to hear your own take on these in the discussion. We've got this familiarity with what we've grown up with and experienced. And that's a major issue, but we're talking about transformation. And it's particularly challenging for those of us. And some of the land use transformations that are needed, such as from commercial forestry or intensive grouse moor management, or deer management or livestock farming, have major implications for the socioeconomics and indeed for brand rural Scotland. So we have to face up to the challenges and indeed the opportunities underlying these. And of course, if we shift from the left-hand side shown here to the right-hand side, we're going to lose important areas of open ground, important for a range of key species such as upland waders. And we will lose the wildness of the open landscapes that are so dear to us in Scotland. And in all of this, active management is absolutely essential to achieve the biodiversity improvement. So we're talking about predator control, managing fire breaks, disease management, etc. You know, this shift towards rewilding of the landscape is not about abandoning the landscape. If anything, you need to invest more heavily in active management of the landscape. And so we're talking about putting nature-based solutions in place, whether that's natural flood management to reduce runoff, slow the flow of runoff rivers from high mountain areas into floodplains, planting of woods, re-meandering of channels, the introduction of beavers in some areas, which will greatly help halt the runoff of water, right down to our towns and cities where we have sustainable urban drainage, the sort of blue-greening of cities and restoring urban watercourses, etc. And I'll say a wee bit more of this at the very end. And actually, just to sort of go back on the challenge of ecosystem restoration, I joined colleagues at COP26 last week to talk about what's happened in the flow country in Caithness and Sutherland, and really the challenge of restoring the peatland ecosystems. They are damaged by afforestation in the 70s and 80s. Absolutely formidable challenges, as these images show. And of course, peatland restoration here is so important. Yes, I'm being crude here, saying a broken bog is a liability, but of course, if you've got a restored bog on the right-hand side of the graphic here, you're sequestering, you're holding on to carbon dioxide, which is contributing so fundamentally to climate heating. But where a bog is exposed, where it's been planted over or eroding, it's the carbon is oxidizing into carbon dioxide. So peatland restoration is so fundamentally important. And in the flow country, which holds 400 millitons of carbon, that's 2 times all our woods and forests in Britain. Globally, you've got peatlands holding 600 gigatons of carbon, 2 times the world's forest resource. And then you think that blanket bog covers only 3% of the Earth's surface, and yet it's second only to the world ocean as a carbon sink. So we're absolutely right to invest heavily in peatland restoration. And this image here sort of brings into very sharp focus what needs to be done. And looking globally, as I've been doing recently on the peatland restoration challenge, I mean, 25% of Europe's peatlands are degraded. There's 50% of the peatlands in the European Union, and the extent of degradation of peatlands increases as you move southwards. And in the UK, which belongs to what's called the Atlantic, raised in blanket bog range, 68% of the peatlands are degraded, 56% of peatlands and protected areas are degraded. In Scotland, about 80% of peatlands are in a degraded state. So the challenge of peatland restoration is utterly immense. And so in the flow country, phenomenal work taking place to restore the peatlands, stripping out the trees, ditch blocking, so that you have scenes such as this, where the peatlands are now gradually recovering. And indeed, since 1994, with some great research work and trials and major restoration, with substantial funding from the EU LIFE programme, we've really been able to develop knowledge and experience and then good practice for peatland restoration, to the extent that now 2,600 hectares of forestry are restored to Blanket Bog, and the lessons we've learned from that are contributing nationally and globally to peatland restoration. We should be mindful here that the Scottish Government has committed £250 million towards peatland restoration by the year 2030. And a sort of special plug here for the work that's being done by Roxanne Anderson and colleagues in the ERI and Thurso. This is absolutely fundamentally important research that's helping us identify what needs to be done to restore the peatlands. And indeed, Roxanne is working closely with Terra Motion, this great organisation, and ourselves and some other partners to identify across Britain and Ireland those areas where we've got most degraded peat, and therefore where we should invest most significantly in carbon offsetting. So fantastic work now involving satellite imagery to identify not only where we need to restore the peatlands, but the savings we'll make through doing that. So science is playing a phenomenal role here. And just for nature-based solutions, I'm just going to end on some examples here, some great examples we've got of urban regeneration in Glasgow City Council, a whole range of activities that are being put in place here, again to tackle the climate emergency and the nature crisis, and really to help connect people much more meaningfully with nature. And likewise for coastal erosion, sort of a whole range of activities being put in place. Here, the example from Fife Council, where we've got community engagement, storm surge enterprises being put in place to try and protect our coast from sea level encroachment. And flood management, I touched on river water courses and the sort of natural flood management can take place, improving our wildlife. That's being done in Scottish Borders Council, some fantastic nationally leading work to improve the state of our rivers, again to tackle flood risk and to improve the richness of biodiversity. And finally, climate sequestration. And again, a whole range of activities, whether at sea, peatlands, or in the woods, again to try and jointly tackle the two crises. And it's fascinating, just towards the very end now, looking at the funding model here and looking for 2019-2020, the Scottish Government's annual provision for biodiversity. And you look at the graphic here, and the great bulk of the money was spent on agri-environment support. And hence, a great deal of work now is being devoted towards trying to tailor agri-environment support to provide far greater benefits for biodiversity. We've had a government announce a nature restoration fund, as I say, £55 million for the next 3 years or so, and that is going to make a major difference for biodiversity, hopefully putting in place many of the nature-based solutions work that I've just been doing. And finally, my final slide is then to think about the funding for all this. Who is going to pay for this? It's not just government. So we need public-private funding for this. We need policy, regulation, and market pool measures being put in place to ensure that organisations are far better fitted to invest in a whole range of measures to try and sustain nature and to develop sort of nature-based solutions. And here, a challenge for us in the public sector and an organisation such as mine, in Nature Scot, is to demonstrate the impact that private finance can have in helping us meet our carbon targets. And my final point relates to the economy being embedded in nature. If you haven't had a chance to do so, it is important to read Partha Dasgupta's report on climate and nature, and embedding our economy not in sort of traditional economic enterprises, but in nature. We can do so much with nature to improve the state of our economy, and the cost of not taking the sorts of actions that I've outlined here are absolutely considerable. So I'll leave it at that. I've tried to be fairly provocative and probably conversational, but I'm hoping that provides a basis for a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Des. That was Yeah, extremely thought-provoking and very comprehensive as well. And well, maybe I'll kick off with a question. Okay. So, well, I'm based in Shetland, so and there's quite a bit of peatland in Shetland, as you're well aware, and it's those who want to develop wind farms in Shetland are a bit in sort of conflict with those who want to maintain the peatland or to minimise the effect of putting up wind generators. And I was just wondering, do you happen to have a sort of an idea of the state of the peatlands in Shetland and whether we shouldn't be, well, we've already started, so it's a bit it's too late now, but should we be further developing wind generators on Shetland's peatlands?
Well, I mean, it's immensely challenging, isn't it? So yes, and of course we've got detailed maps of now the sort of carbon richness in peatlands across Britain and Ireland, and of course that covers Shetland. So it's first of all trying to avoid the deep peat areas, but secondly using our carbon calculators to very carefully compare what damage will be done and the carbon emissions from peatland that's given over to wind farms with the gains from the wind farms themselves. I mean, some calculations I was looking at for some wind farms in the north of Scotland, you see the savings arising after 6 or 7 years. And bear in mind, these wind farms are given approval for 25 years. So for the first 6 to 7 years, yes, there's a net loss in terms of the emissions of carbon, but beyond that, you're actually doing more for the balance sheet by encouraging renewable energy. So the trick is that, and there's no simple answer here, it's really try and avoid those areas with the important peat resources and make sure you put appropriate mitigation measures in place.
Thank you. Just before I ask you Frank's question he's got in the chat, there was just one further one. I like that image of Scotland 2021 and Scotland 2041, which makes Scotland, it looks like Norway, basically, with some of the changes, which I always think is pretty good. I like Norway very much. And I was just wondering again, taking the narrow Shetland view here, what would there be? What would a rewilded or a Shetland in 2041 look like? Would it be changed much, or would it just look much the same?
No, I think it will be different. And there's actually a marvelous book now called Shetland's Living Landscape, which was produced by David Spence, who was a professor of botany at St Andrews, and he produced the book. I think it was in 1978 or 77, and it's absolutely fantastic because he was comparing the islands within Shetland with the mainland habitats. So there's a whole range of images of the ungrazed islands in Shetland and then the sort of more widely grazed landscape. And the imagery is fascinating. You look at that and you realize that even in Shetland, in this sort of windswept landscape, there could be a far greater diversity of shrub and scrub vegetation. So I would hope that the landscape would look different because it's going to be so good in terms of sequestering carbon. But that will only happen if people want it to happen. And it comes back to my earlier comment about us being used to what we were brought up with. So any form of change can be challenging. And it's interesting what you say about the Norwegian landscape. I too have spent a lot of time in Norway. But talking to people in Norway, they love the Scottish landscape because it's so open and spacious and wild. And and I've said, well, actually, as far as I'm concerned, your landscape's the envy in terms of some parts of the Highlands. But it comes down to perceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. I've met Norwegians who are very keen on our heathery landscapes too, and also come to Scotland to climb our green mountains, which they like. Thank you very much. So, I'll look up that book, by the way, by Spence, and read that. There's a question here from Frank. He's no longer in our sort of our presenter bit. He's in with everybody else here, and he's got a question. I much prefer the term ecosystem restoration rather than rewilding. What's your feeling about the growing need to move towards whole countryside management rather than reserves? And how do you see the role of island environments as leading the change?
Yeah, no, so, well, as you'd expect from Frank, these are great and perceptive questions. So let's work back away. Reserves don't work. So, you know, the protected areas mantra we've had hasn't worked. So just by ring fencing nature, we're not preventing the loss of biodiversity. And we've got a global commitment to having 30% of our land and seas under protected area status. Actually, our seas are up to 36% already. But even on land, if we ring fence 30% as protected areas, it won't work. That won't help. What we do in what's called the wider countryside, how we network areas for nature is absolutely vital. So I think on that, reserves play a very small role. In terms of Frank's last question, in terms of what can we do in the islands are a brilliant example of how communities can work together to make a difference for nature, because none of this is possible unless communities, as it were, say we have a problem, we also have opportunities. If we can rally around a strategy, a framework for action, we can get the resources, communities then will make it happen. I mean, having spent some time in Harris and aware, of course, of Frank and colleagues' great work in Lewis, it is phenomenal what you can do with a community approach. But without that community approach, you know, what's the alternative? Sort of diktat, sort of saying thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. That will not work. And at the core of this, I come back to this, recognizing we have this nature climate crisis. And therefore, by working with nature, we really can make a difference, not only for nature and our lives, but also in tackling the climate emergency. And I mean it when I say around 30% of our net zero targets, sort of carbon reductions, can be met through working with nature. And that's a great, it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity for island communities.
Yeah, absolutely, and sort of transformative for our sort of local environment as well. Beth Mouat's got a sort of follow-up question on that. Beth is leading on the UHI Islands Strategy, and she's based at the North Atlantic Fisheries College, so she has a great interest in the maritime side of this. But her particular question is, there appears to be a significant interest in rewilding in Scotland as an investment opportunity. And so how do we ensure effective ownership of the process, taking communities with us, rather than it being done to us by those with no interest or understanding of the local context?
So Beth, thank you for that question, Beth. You're absolutely right. And I realised I ducked the question about ecosystem restoration versus rewilding. Rewilding is just a term that's being used, you know, it's a popular term. But actually, what we're talking about is ecosystem restoration and regeneration. So it's just nailing that question that Frank put. I actually prefer ecosystem restoration and regeneration. I think that's a much better term. But turning to what Beth has posed there, you know, this is difficult. Some of the large estates that have been on the market recently have been bought for offsetting reasons, with possibly, because I can't say for certain, but possibly with little community discussion. This is a concern because, again, unless we have community engagement in what's to be done with a parcel of land, for an owner or a manager then to come along and impose, you know, whether it's peatland restoration or woodland regeneration, won't work. So in terms of the future of I'll call them ecosystem restoration projects, community involvement is absolutely essential. It's actually one of the core principles of taking this work forward successfully. It cannot be done without community co-design involvement through to creating the green jobs that are so important to many fragile local communities.
Thank you very much. That's yeah, a very yeah, a very thoughtful response. Green jobs. I mean, that's a positive thing that we can use to encourage people to engage with this process. Well, following up on your ecosystem restoration project answer there, you pointed to the fact that Scotland is sort of leading the way when it comes to the flow country, and that the research that's being done there is being sort of used in other places. So I just wondered, more generally, where does Scotland stand sort of internationally as an example of ecosystem restoration activity?
Well, I think Scotland's punching way above its weight, and for peatland restoration, I think it's phenomenal what's happened. I mean, we have our own peatland action plan. I mentioned the £250 million investment in peatland restoration, but that's, you know, the founding basis for that was the work done by RSPB and Highland Council and ERI and Forestry and Land Scotland in the north of Scotland, and that, you know, is now reverberating across the UK and much further afield. I mean, I always smile wryly when I hear about the beginnings of peatland restoration in Wales or the north of England, you know, and sort of being trumpeted as a sort of great new approach when we've been doing it for years. And likewise, you know, coastal restoration is an amazing project, Dynamic Coast, which is addressing sort of coastal realignment and coastal retreat and the measures we need to put in place. And again, you know, Scotland's, you know, at the forefront of that with people like Jim Hanson at Glasgow University and my colleague Rennie and many others. And we're so fortunate to have a really excellent research base here. I mean, I name-checked Roxanne and colleagues' work at the ERI, but, you know, equally, there's very important marine work being done in Orkney and Shetland, and of course, work being done in the Western Isles. And all of this is feeding into the national effort that we're leading here. We will have a biodiversity centre of expertise in Scotland in 2023, and that I very much hope will be an international champion for biodiversity revival in Scotland. So it's not just, you know, Scotland's a small country, so there's only so much we can do in Scotland, that we can lead by example, and that is massively important. That's what we're really good at in Scotland, I think. It's really sort of promoting what can be done to other parts of the world, actually.
That's great to hear. So the people are thanking you for your presentation here in the chat. And but before I do that, I'd just like to ask sort of one question. I was wondering, my particular interest is intangible cultural heritage of Scotland and the different Gaelic culture, Norse culture. And I was just wondering, is there a role for intangible cultural heritage in this push and campaign for a better, more environmentally diverse Scotland?
But of course there is, Andrew, because I mean, these cultures you've just described there, nature's embedded in them. And I think we forget that sometimes. You know, the Gaelic language, the place names, and going back, you know, the sort of the Viking place names. So much of these refer to attributes of the landscape, or indeed features of nature. So we have to embrace these broader cultures. There's a fascinating piece of work done by the late Richard Evans, who actually was able to depict the former distribution of eagles, in both white-tailed eagles and golden eagles in the UK, simply on the basis of place names. Because place names tell us so much about nature, about the richness and composition of nature. So of course we have to reach into these cultures. And one final point, if I may, a provocative point, is across the world, about 6% of the global population consists of indigenous populations. and they have to look after more than half of the global biodiversity, yet rarely are they included in formal negotiations and discussions. So unless you reach into indigenous communities and into these wider cultures, you're not going to have the impact that we want to see happening here. And it is a climate emergency that we face. Unless we take action, we're going to leave a mess for future generations.
And I think that is a great place to round it up. Thank you very much indeed, Des, for a really fascinating presentation, and an encouraging one as well. So we know there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, but it can be, and Scotland's the place to sort of develop techniques and expertise that can be then shared with the rest of the world, and our intangible cultural heritage can play a role in that. So again, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for sharing your time, and hopefully we can pick up with you in future and find out how things are developing. So,
of course, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Great way of ending it. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye now.